3 years ago, 78-year-old Theodore Blackwood, patriarch of a $50 million media empire, vanished from his locked study during a family dinner party. Police concluded he'd wandered off due to early-stage dementia and likely died of exposure in the nearby mountains. His will was probated, his fortune divided among 3 children, and the family moved on. But when his granddaughter finally brings herself to clean out his private office, she discovers something hidden in his antique desk that will prove Theodore didn't wander off and that someone in the family has been lying for 3 years. Morning mist clung to Lake Tahoe's surface as Caroline Blackwood's hand trembled against the brass doorknob of her grandfather's study. The heavy oak door opened with the same creak it had made during countless childhood visits, when she'd burst through to find Theodore hunched over spreadsheets, the air thick with pipe tobacco and possibility. Now the room waited like a tomb. "Take your time, dear." David Chen's voice carried the practiced gentleness of an attorney who'd shepherded grieving families through estate settlements for 30 years. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes held genuine sympathy. "I know this isn't easy." Caroline stepped inside, and the familiar cocktail hit her: pipe tobacco, leather bindings, and the faint vanilla of Theodore's fountain pen ink. Through the tall windows, lake light danced across mahogany surfaces, casting the same patterns she'd watched as a 10-year-old, cross-legged on the Persian rug, while Theodore explained compound interest and media consolidation. On the desk, his reading glasses sat folded beside yesterday's Wall Street Journal. Or rather, 3 years ago's Wall Street Journal, dated October 15th, 2021. "It looks like he just stepped out for coffee," she whispered. "Your father wanted to preserve everything exactly as Theodore left it." David pulled out his tablet, stylus hovering over the estate inventory. "The family thought you should be the one to decide what stays and what goes." Caroline traced her finger along the desk's polished edge, remembering summer afternoons when Theodore would let her sort his correspondence, teaching her to spot the difference between genuine business inquiries and obvious scams. "Did you learn anything useful today, Cricket?" he'd ask, using the childhood nickname that made her feel important, needed. "The police searched thoroughly?" she asked. "Every drawer, every file." David's stylus tapped against the screen. Detective Martinez was particularly methodical. No signs of struggle, no indication Theodore was upset or confused that evening. He simply left. Caroline's jaw tightened. Everyone accepted that Theodore had wandered off due to dementia, but she'd never bought it. At 78, her grandfather had been sharper than most CEOs half his age. His recall for names, market trends, and complex financial structures had been flawless. The morning before he disappeared, he'd called her at college to discuss her journalism thesis, suggesting 3 sources she hadn't considered and predicting a media merger that happened 2 months later. She began opening desk drawers systematically. The center drawer held fountain pens arranged by color, blues first, then blacks, then the special red one he used for final approvals. The left drawers contained business correspondence, filed chronologically with color-coded tabs. The right drawers held personal items, photographs of family milestones, industry awards, his collection of vintage chess pieces from tournaments around the world. Then she reached the bottom right drawer, locked. The brass mechanism was small but sturdy, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Caroline examined it closely, running her fingers along the edges, looking for any give or weakness. "David, this drawer won't open." He looked up from his tablet, frowning. "That's odd. The police inventory doesn't mention any locked drawers. They would have requested keys for everything during the investigation." Caroline began searching the other drawers methodically. In the top left, beneath a stack of business cards from media industry contacts, her fingers found a small brass key, tarnished with age but still functional. Click. Inside were documents that made her breath catch. Bank statements showing transfers to accounts she didn't recognize. Letters from a San Francisco private investigator specializing in corporate fraud. And beneath everything, a handwritten note in Theodore's precise script, the fountain pen's strokes still sharp and confident. "My dear Caroline, if you're reading this, my suspicions about my family have proven tragically correct. Someone has been systematically stealing from Blackwood Media, over $3.2 million, hidden through false consulting contracts and offshore transfers. Worse, I believe they plan to eliminate me before I can expose them. I've documented everything. Our special place holds all the evidence. Trust no one until you've seen proof. Remember where we solved puzzles together, where you learned that every move has consequences. All my love, grandfather. October 14th, 2021. Caroline's hands shook as she read the letter again. Theodore hadn't been confused or forgetful. He'd been conducting a methodical investigation into embezzlement within his own family, and he'd suspected murder. Through the study windows, morning mist was burning off the lake, revealing the distant mountains where everyone believed Theodore had died alone and confused. But according to this letter, he died knowing exactly who had betrayed him. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. "Caroline?" Her father's voice, warm and familiar. "How's it going in there?" She quickly folded the letter and slipped it into her jacket pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Fine, Dad. Just sorting through old papers." James Blackwood appeared in the doorway, looking every inch the successful media executive in his tailored charcoal suit. Salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, Italian leather shoes silent on the hardwood floor. But his eyes, had they always been this watchful, immediately found the open drawer. "I didn't know your grandfather had any locked drawers." His tone was casual, but Caroline caught something else underneath. What was in there? Old financial records, bank statements from years back. The lie came easily, but Caroline felt her father's gaze boring into her. Nothing current or important. James stepped closer to the desk, and Caroline noticed for the first time how her father moved, not with the relaxed confidence of family comfort, but with the careful precision of someone managing a situation. "You know, if you find anything related to company finances, I should review it personally. As CEO, I'm legally responsible for all corporate records." "Of course." Caroline forced a smile, the same bright expression she'd perfected during childhood piano recitals. "I'll let you know if anything relevant turns up." But as James lingered in the doorway, his presence filling the space like smoke, Caroline realized everything had changed. Her grandfather's letter had transformed the family's tragedy into something far more sinister. Theodore Blackwood hadn't wandered off in confusion. Someone had murdered him to keep their secrets buried in the deep, cold waters of Lake Tahoe. Caroline waited in her car until James's BMW disappeared down the winding mountain road, then pulled out her phone. She scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in years, Detective Sarah Martinez. "Sarah, it's Caroline Blackwood. I need to see you. I found something in grandfather's study, something that changes everything." They met an hour later at a lakefront cafe where summer tourists wouldn't recognize either of them. Afternoon light filtered through pine trees, casting shifting shadows across their table. Sarah looked older than Caroline remembered, lines around her dark eyes, silver threading through her black hair. But her gaze remained sharp as obsidian. "Show me." Caroline handed over the letter and watched Sarah's expression harden as she read. The detective's fingers, Caroline noticed, bore small scars from years of handling evidence, careful hands that had learned to treat every document as potentially crucial. "Caroline, if this is authentic, we may have been investigating a murder as a missing person case for 3 years." Sarah folded the letter carefully, creasing it along its original lines. "Your grandfather mentions evidence hidden somewhere special. Any idea what he meant?" The answer came immediately, accompanied by sense memory, the smell of lake water and wood polish, the feel of smooth chess pieces, the sound of Theodore's patient voice explaining strategy. "The boathouse. We used to play chess there every afternoon during my summer visits. He called it our puzzle palace. We need to check it out. But first, tell me about the family finances in 2021. Who had access to company accounts?" Caroline considered the question, loyalty warring with growing suspicion. All 3 of grandfather's children worked for Blackwood Media in senior positions. Dad was CFO, so he controlled all financial operations, payroll, investments, vendor payments. Aunt Patricia ran the television division, which meant huge budgets for programming and advertising contracts. Uncle Marcus handled newspapers and digital properties, including subscription revenue and online advertising sales. "Any of them having money problems that you knew about?" Caroline hesitated, family loyalty warring with the need for truth. Patricia was going through a brutal divorce. Her husband was demanding half of everything, including her ownership stake in Blackwood Media. The legal fees alone were astronomical. I heard her on the phone with her attorney once, talking about 6-figure monthly bills. What about Marcus? Bad investments. He'd gotten involved with tech startups that crashed spectacularly in 2020-21. I overheard Dad mention that Marcus had leveraged his Blackwood dividends to fund them, and when the companies folded, he was facing massive losses. Sarah made notes on her phone, stylus moving in quick, efficient strokes. "And your father?" Caroline's stomach tightened. He was having an affair. His girlfriend was significantly younger and had very expensive tastes. Designer everything, luxury vacations to places like Monaco and Aspen, a high-end penthouse in San Francisco that Dad was paying for. Mom knew but was pretending she didn't. The whole situation was costing him a fortune. So all three siblings had serious financial pressure that might have motivated embezzlement. Sarah's stylus moved across her screen. What happened after Theodore disappeared? How quickly did they move to settle his estate? Caroline's stomach clenched as she recalled those strange, hurried weeks. That's what always bothered me most about the whole situation. Within a month of grandfather being declared legally dead, Dad had officially taken over as CEO of Blackwood Media. Patricia and Marcus both sold their ownership shares back to the company immediately, essentially converting their inheritance into cash rather than maintaining long-term stakes in the business. The entire estate was wrapped up and distributed within 6 months. That's unusually fast for a $50 million family business with complex holdings. The family attorney said everyone was eager to avoid prolonged legal battles and negative media attention. But looking back, it felt like everyone was in a tremendous hurry to finalize the inheritance distribution and move on from grandfather's disappearance. They drove to the Blackwood estate as afternoon shadows stretched across Lake Tahoe like dark fingers reaching toward the mountains. Caroline parked near the main house, but led Sarah down a wooded path toward the water, where the family pier extended into the lake like a wooden bridge to nowhere. The boathouse sat at the pier's end, its Tudor architecture echoing the main house in miniature. Caroline had spent countless happy hours here during childhood summers, but now the building felt ominous rather than welcoming, as if it held secrets that had been waiting 3 years to be discovered. Caroline used her key. She'd kept it all these years, a talisman of summer memories, and the door swung open with a soft creak. Inside, everything was exactly as she remembered. The antique chess set positioned on its small table, pieces arranged mid-game from their last match. Comfortable leather chairs arranged to face the spectacular lake view. Built-in shelves lined with puzzle books, chess manuals, and collections of brain teasers from around the world. "This is where we'd spend our afternoons," Caroline said softly. "Grandfather would set up increasingly complex chess problems, and I'd work on them while he handled phone calls or correspondence. He said solving puzzles taught you to see patterns that others missed." She went straight to the chess table and opened its elegant drawer. Instead of game pieces, she found a waterproof envelope sealed with red wax bearing the Blackwood family crest. This is it. Inside were photocopies of bank records, wire transfer receipts, and email printouts documenting systematic theft over nearly 2 years. False invoices for Meridian Consulting Services that provided no actual services. Payments routed to numbered accounts in the Cayman Islands. Amounts that started cautiously small but grew bolder over time. $23,000 here, $47,000 there, eventually reaching $89,000 in single transactions. But the smoking gun was an email chain between the thief and an offshore banking contact. The messages discussed timing, amounts, and most chillingly, the need for secrecy. T is asking too many pointed questions about the Meridian contracts. He's demanding documentation that could expose our entire operation. We need to accelerate the final transfer. Can you process the $850,000 by end of business Friday? After that, this problem will resolve itself permanently. The final email was dated October 13th, 2021, 2 days before Theodore's disappearance. "Sarah, look at the header information." Caroline's voice was barely above a whisper. "This email came from a Blackwood Media corporate account. We should be able to trace exactly who had access to this specific account during this time period. Corporate IT systems maintain detailed logs of user access, login times, and message activity," Sarah confirmed, photographing each document with her phone. "With a warrant, we can determine which family member was communicating with offshore banks about transferring nearly $1 million of stolen money." As they prepared to leave the boathouse with Theodore's carefully preserved evidence, the sound of footsteps echoed on the wooden pier outside. Deliberate footsteps, not the casual pace of someone taking an evening stroll. The door opened, and James Blackwood stepped inside. His eyes immediately locked onto the waterproof envelope in Caroline's hands, and his expression shifted from paternal concern to something much colder. "I figured I'd find you both here," he said quietly, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "You always were too curious for your own good, Caroline, just like your grandfather." Caroline instinctively stepped backward, putting the chess table between herself and her father. Through the boathouse windows, lake water reflected the last rays of sunlight, creating patterns that reminded her of childhood summers that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. "Dad, I can explain. No need." James moved further into the room, and Caroline noticed he was no longer wearing his business suit. Instead, he'd changed into dark jeans and a black pullover clothing that would be nearly invisible in the gathering dusk. "I know exactly what you found. The question is what you plan to do about it." Sarah positioned herself between father and daughter, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. "Mr. Blackwood, Caroline has discovered evidence of potential financial crimes and conspiracy to commit murder. We need to discuss this situation at the police station." James laughed, a sound Caroline had never heard before. It was hollow, calculating, devoid of any warmth or humor. "Detective Martinez, my daughter has stumbled onto some old business correspondence that she's completely misinterpreting, just like Theodore did in his final months." "The emails specifically mention eliminating grandfather permanently," Caroline shot back, fear making her voice shake despite her efforts to remain calm. "They discuss transferring stolen money before he could expose the theft." "Stolen money?" James shook his head, but his expression remained cold. "Caroline, you're seeing criminal conspiracies where none exist. You're making the same mistake Theodore made, interpreting legitimate business transactions as evidence of theft and murder. Grandfather wasn't losing his mind, wasn't he?" James pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a photo gallery. "Look at this." He showed them an image that made Caroline's breath catch. Theodore, from his final weeks, disheveled, wild-eyed, standing in the mansion's marble foyer in his pajamas and bedroom slippers at what appeared to be midday. Or this. Another photo. Theodore arguing with Mrs. Rodriguez, the longtime housekeeper, pointing an accusing finger at her while she looked frightened and confused. And this. A third image showed Theodore in his study, surrounded by papers and documents connected with red string like a conspiracy theorist's paranoid web. Charts and photos taped to the walls in a chaotic pattern that spoke of mental deterioration rather than methodical investigation. As James pulled out his phone, something small and white fell from his pocket and rolled across the wooden floor. Caroline recognized it instantly, a chess pawn carved from ivory with her initials CB scratched into its base. The piece Theodore had made for her 10th birthday, spending hours in his workshop to create something special just for her. "Where did these photos come from?" Caroline asked, her voice barely steady. "Security cameras throughout the house." Theodore had become increasingly paranoid and erratic in his final months. He was convinced everyone was plotting against him, that Mrs. Rodriguez was poisoning his food, that the gardener was spying on him, that his own children were planning to steal his fortune and possibly murder him. Sarah studied the phone screen, her detective training analyzing the images for authenticity. These photos do show signs of significant cognitive decline and paranoid behavior, early-stage Alzheimer's disease with pronounced paranoid features, James confirmed, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine sadness. "We had him evaluated by 3 different specialists. All reached the same conclusion. Theodore was experiencing progressive dementia that was causing him to misinterpret routine activities as evidence of criminal conspiracies." Caroline stared at the images of her grandfather, trying to reconcile them with her memories of his sharp wit and business acumen. But the investigation into embezzlement, the private detective, the financial records he'd gathered, were all based on Theodore's increasingly diseased imagination, James interrupted. He became convinced that normal business transactions were evidence of theft. The Meridian consulting contracts were completely legitimate services, fully approved by our board of directors and properly documented in our corporate records. Then why hide all this evidence? Why not tell the family? Tell me about his condition. James's expression crumpled slightly, and for a moment he looked like the father Caroline remembered from her childhood. "Because we loved him, Caroline. Theodore Blackwood had spent 60 years building one of the most respected media companies in America. Did you want his legacy to be tabloid headlines about a once brilliant man reduced to paranoid delusions and conspiracy theories?" The boathouse had grown darker as they talked, shadows lengthening across the lake outside. Sarah remained alert, her hand still near her weapon, but her posture had relaxed slightly. "Mr. Blackwood, what exactly happened the night your father disappeared?" James sank into one of the leather chairs, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. We were trying to help him. Theodore had become convinced that his entire family was conspiring to murder him for inheritance money. He was threatening to go to the FBI with his evidence of our criminal conspiracy to steal from Blackwood Media. So you arranged some kind of intervention. We hired a private geriatric psychiatry team to evaluate him and recommend appropriate care options. Dr. Victoria Kane and her associates specialize in dealing with elderly patients who have become violent or paranoid due to cognitive decline. James rubbed his temples. But when Theodore saw the medical team arriving at the house, he became absolutely terrified. In his confused mental state, he interpreted their presence as confirmation that we were there to kill him. Caroline felt her worldview shifting like pieces on a chessboard. He ran, straight out through the French doors and into the woods behind the house. We followed, trying to convince him to come back to accept help. But Theodore was utterly convinced we were chasing him with intent to murder him. The more we called his name, the faster he ran, going deeper and deeper into the forest. What happened then? James's voice broke slightly. He collapsed from sheer exhaustion and terror about a mile from the house. When we finally caught up to him, he was clutching his chest, gasping for breath. Massive heart attack brought on by physical exertion and psychological stress. We immediately called for emergency medical services, but he died before the paramedics could reach us. The boathouse fell silent except for the gentle lapping of lake water against the pier pilings. Theodore died of natural causes, James continued, but he died because his own family had terrified him, because the disease in his brain had convinced him that the people who loved him most were trying to kill him. Can you imagine anything more heartbreaking? 2 weeks later, Caroline sat in Dr. Rebecca Williams's office, watching brain scans flicker across a wall-mounted monitor. Gray matter, dark spots, activity patterns that looked like storm systems on a weather map. Your grandfather's case presented classic early-stage Alzheimer's with pronounced paranoid features, Dr. Williams explained, clicking through digital images of Theodore's brain. These dark areas here show protein buildup that disrupts normal cognitive function. Through the office windows, Lake Tahoe stretched toward distant mountains, the same view Theodore had loved but could no longer trust by the end of his life. Caroline watched morning mist rise from the water's surface, delicate, ephemeral, vanishing as sunlight touched it. But he seemed so normal most of the time, Caroline said, so sharp and intelligent. Early-stage dementia is insidious precisely because it preserves so much. Your grandfather retained his vocabulary, his personality, his analytical skills, even his sense of humor. But the disease systematically destroyed his ability to interpret information correctly, especially regarding the people closest to him. Dr. Williams pulled up Theodore's medical file on her computer. Look at the documented progression of symptoms over his final year. Increasing suspicion of family members, belief that food was being tampered with, conviction that routine business transactions were evidence of theft. All textbook presentations of dementia-related paranoia. The doctor clicked to a video file. This is from his neurological evaluation 6 weeks before his death. On the screen, Theodore sat across from Dr. Williams in this same office. He looked distinguished, articulate, completely rational, until she asked him about his family. "My children think I don't know what they're doing," Theodore said, his voice calm but his eyes hard. "They've been systematically stealing from my company, transferring money to offshore accounts. They think because I'm getting older I won't notice, but I've documented everything." "Theodore, your financial advisor reviewed those transactions. They were legitimate. He's part of it too." Theodore leaned forward intensely. "They're all working together, even you probably. This whole evaluation is designed to discredit me so they can have me declared incompetent." Caroline watched her grandfather's face on the screen, seeing the intelligence she remembered, but also something else, a terrible certainty that everyone around him was lying, that he alone could see the truth. "The cruelest aspect of this particular form of dementia," Dr. Williams said gently, "is that it specifically attacks the brain's ability to trust familiar faces while leaving other cognitive functions intact." Theodore could still analyze complex financial reports, but he couldn't recognize that his own children were trying to help him. After leaving the doctor's office, Caroline met with Victoria Kane at the same lakefront cafe where she'd shown Sarah the incriminating letter. Victoria turned out to be exactly what James had claimed, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in dementia-related family interventions. "Your family hired our team to help manage Theodore's transition to appropriate medical care," Victoria explained, her voice carrying the professional calm of someone who dealt with similar tragedies many times. We're not armed security contractors or criminals. We're medical professionals who help families cope when dementia patients become convinced their loved ones are trying to harm them. The weapons we saw in the boathouse. Victoria opened her medical bag, revealing syringes marked haloperidol and soft fabric restraints. Sometimes medical sedation is the most humane approach when patients become violent or self-destructive due to paranoid delusions. Your grandfather's case was particularly challenging because his delusions were so elaborate and well documented. She showed Caroline photos from Theodore's final resting place, a peaceful meadow overlooking Lake Tahoe, marked by a simple granite headstone surrounded by wildflowers. Your father visits regularly. He brings chess puzzles and reads newspaper business sections aloud. I think he believes Theodore can still hear him, still cares about the company he built. As the pieces fell into place, Caroline realized her quest for justice had revealed a different kind of tragedy. Theodore hadn't been murdered by greedy relatives seeking inheritance money. He'd been killed by a disease that had transformed his greatest strength, his sharp, analytical business mind, into a weapon against the people who loved him most. The private investigator Theodore had hired confirmed Dr. Williams' assessment. Your grandfather insisted I investigate his family for embezzlement, the man told Caroline over the phone. I spent weeks reviewing financial records, and I found absolutely no evidence of theft or fraud. But when I tried to explain this to Theodore, he became convinced I was part of the conspiracy too. Even Sarah Martinez, reviewing the complete case file, had reached the same conclusion. The security footage, the medical evaluations, the witness statements, everything points to dementia-related paranoia rather than actual criminal activity, she told Caroline. I know this isn't the resolution you were hoping for, but sometimes the truth is more complex than we expect. Caroline spent hours reading about Alzheimer's disease, learning how it could turn brilliant minds against themselves. She discovered that paranoid delusions often focused on the people patients had once trusted most, that the disease seemed to specifically target the neural pathways responsible for recognizing familiar faces and maintaining emotional bonds. The Meridian consulting contracts, which had seemed so suspicious in Theodore's notes, turned out to be exactly what James had claimed, legitimate business services properly approved and documented. The false invoices were real billing statements for actual work performed by qualified consultants. Most heartbreaking of all, Caroline learned that Theodore's investigative skills had remained sharp even as his ability to interpret information correctly deteriorated. His research methods were sound, his documentation meticulous, his attention to detail impressive. The only problem was that his brilliant mind was systematically misinterpreting every piece of evidence he gathered. 6 months after discovering Theodore's letter, Caroline stood beside his grave in the mountain meadow Victoria had shown her. Morning mist clung to the wildflowers growing around the simple granite marker. Theodore Blackwood, 1943-2021. Beloved father and grandfather, a brilliant mind at rest. She placed the white chess king from their old set on the headstone, the piece that had always been her favorite because Theodore had taught her it was the most important piece on the board, the one everything else existed to protect. I'm sorry I didn't understand, grandfather, she whispered to the stone. I'm sorry you spent your final months so afraid of the people who loved you most. Pine branches whispered overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the lake. Sounds Theodore would have recognized and found comforting if his diseased brain had allowed him to trust what he was hearing. The investigation had concluded with a comprehensive report from the Tahoe County Sheriff's Department. Theodore's death had been officially reclassified from missing person, presumed dead, to death by natural causes during dementia-related episode. No criminal charges would be filed against any family members. But Caroline had insisted on complete transparency with the media. The Blackwood family had released a detailed statement acknowledging Theodore's Alzheimer's diagnosis and announcing the establishment of a foundation dedicated to dementia research and family support services. We want other families to understand that paranoid delusions aren't personal failures or character flaws, Caroline had told the press conference. They're medical symptoms that require professional treatment, infinite patience, and above all, love that persists even when it's not recognized or returned. James had used a significant portion of his inheritance to fund the Theodore Blackwood Center for Dementia Family Support, providing counseling and resources for families navigating similar challenges. The center's mission statement, which Caroline had helped write, emphasized that loving someone with dementia meant accepting that they might see you as their enemy while you continued to be their protector. Patricia had endowed a research chair in geriatric psychiatry at UCSF, focusing specifically on the paranoid symptoms that had made Theodore's final months so terrifying. Marcus had established journalism scholarships for students studying the ethics of reporting on mental health issues, ensuring that Theodore's legacy included responsible coverage of diseases that were still stigmatized and misunderstood. Caroline kept the chess set from the boathouse on her desk at the family foundation, along with Theodore's final letter. The letter now served a different purpose, not as evidence of a crime that had never been committed, but as a reminder of how completely a diseased mind could distort reality while retaining all its analytical power. She'd learned that Theodore's investigation had been methodical, intelligent, and utterly convinced of its own accuracy. His research techniques were flawless, his documentation thorough, his logical reasoning sound at every step. The only problem was that the fundamental premise that his family was stealing from him and planning his murder had been a delusion created by the systematic destruction of his brain's ability to trust the people he loved. Some mysteries aren't crimes, Sarah had told Caroline during their final meeting, but they still deserve answers. The hardest part had been forgiving herself for initially suspecting her family of murder, but Dr. Williams had helped her understand that her reaction was natural and even healthy. You refused to accept that your grandfather's brilliant mind could be diminished by disease, the neurologist had explained. That loyalty to his memory, even when it led you down the wrong path, shows how deeply you loved him and how well he'd taught you to fight for truth. As Caroline prepared to leave the meadow, she reflected on what Theodore's case had taught her about the nature of investigation and family love. Sometimes the most compelling evidence points toward the wrong conclusion. Sometimes the people we're trying to protect become convinced we're their greatest threat. Sometimes the very qualities that make us brilliant, skepticism, analytical thinking, attention to detail, can become weapons that our own minds use against us. But understanding these painful truths, Caroline had come to believe, was still better than living with unanswered questions. Theodore's final investigation had been based on delusion, but it had led to real insights about dementia, family loyalty, and the fragile nature of trust between people who care deeply about each other. The mountain meadow remained peaceful as Caroline walked back toward her car. Theodore Blackwood was finally at rest, free from the confusion and terror that had marked his final months. And his family had found a different kind of peace. Not the satisfaction of justice served, but the deeper comfort that comes from understanding difficult truths and choosing love over blame. Caroline placed the white king beside Theodore's headstone one final time, then walked away. The peace would weather here through seasons of snow and sun, a lasting reminder that some investigations end not with justice, but with understanding.